Southern Cone, Hydrocarbon Potential, and Alternative Energies. We are live on YouTube, LinkedIn, and Twitter X. By accessing the QR code above, you can subscribe to the channel and receive notifications for each new video. This is Cleveland Jones, Professor Cleveland Jones, graduate in physics, and you can stop the video afterwards and see in more details. And you can access the his LinkedIn page to see more professional details and have contact with him. And this is Paul Taylor. The same is a geoscientist and a long history in the hydrocarbon exploration. So you can access his LinkedIn page too and see more details about that. Good afternoon, Professor Cleveland Jones and Professor Paul Taylor. It's a pleasure to have you both in the podcast.
Pleasure to be here.
Thank you very much, Armando.
The idea is that Cleveland starts with his thoughts, followed by Paul with his thoughts too. And after that, we can start questions and comments. So up to 15 minutes each one. And Cleveland, please, could you start?
Yes, Cavagna, like I said, maybe you can put a slide, because what I wanted to do is give some background about what general levels of information has been out there. The USGS has done surveys, 2000 and something, 2012, and of course many others in between. But this one of the world assessment of yet to find resources was interesting and important, because they reviewed many areas across the world, and they looked at geological favorability, not so much any environmental impediments, technological challenges might still apply, but that wasn't an overriding concern. Obviously, some cost considerations went in, cutting out some ridiculous plays. But in general, this is not so realistic, but it's more geological underlying potential. But you see that South America, they assessed quite a few areas, basins, that they call them assessment units. And it's important because in the next slide, if you can see, they assessed the entire South America and Caribbean plays that they pointed out, with a significant potential of 125, 26 billion barrels of recoverable resources. That's P50, a little bit more than P50, because P50 is average, this is mean. But you see, it's a very aggressive assessment. But I think, as you know, I've produced many assessments of some Brazilian plays. I think it's still quite conservative, because of course this was done way back in 2010. Even the pre-salt wasn't so well understood, and so on. So definitely the Southern Cone, or the South American is a very promising area for explorationists to consider, where they might put their money in. If you go forward, Cavagna, the USGS did a separate assessment of just the South American assessment units that they looked at. And again, as you know, I don't focus too much on many of the onshore basins and plays, but you can see that they assessed quite a few areas, and their assessment was quite significant, because areas number 7, 9, and 10 in this map correspond to some very significant Brazilian basins, assessed at something like 126 billion barrels of recoverable resources. So we're talking about significant resources in the region. You notice that the southernmost assessment unit, other than the Falklands down there, is that in the Pelotas Basin and so on, and Uruguay basins. They don't look too much at any offshore Argentine areas below that. There's not much reason to do so because there's not much exploration information to suggest that, and an underlying geological evolution of the margin suggests maybe that's not prime areas. But there's still a lot to look at there. What I wanted to do is maybe just briefly outline some of the major countries where this assessment was conducted, and talk about some of the conditions that I think would adjust that. If you go forward, I look at Argentina, because Argentina has these conventional basins that people look at. But, forget that, because this on the right, the blue and the light blue, I think this tells you more about the fantastically wide margin in Argentina that could potentially allow exploration plays to come up if they're proven and so on, quite far from shore, so the areas are very big. This is nothing proven, but we're talking about exploration potential. So it's quite significant, even for Uruguay down south. And if you go to the next one, Uruguay, which is a small country, but again, this is quite well positioned just below Pelotas Basin in Brazil. They have had quite a lot of exploration activity, blocks sold, and some activity there. I don't think we can say that it's been very successful, but some of these plays, until you understand what's going on and how they work, you don't expect successes, right at the beginning. So this is a very promising area as well, I think, and it will probably continue. If we go on, Kavaya, we have Chile and we have Colombia. Colombia is mostly onshore here on the right. I think the only exciting part in Colombia is offshore, because Colombia has already said that they're the exploration plays that they're chasing after are rabbits, not big stuff. Offshore, maybe more significant things. Petrobras even has a large area that they're beginning to work on offshore Colombia. Chile, as long as that country is, unfortunately, it's on the wrong side of Latin America. So you don't expect any bases, but way at way at the tip, right? At the bottom of Patagonia and all that, you have these small little areas that could provide what I call niche opportunities, and they have some potential. Obviously, maybe not very hospitable environment, but it's onshore, basically, near shore in those landlocked seas type. So this could provide niche areas. If we go down even more, Peru, Ecuador, and so on, yes, maybe the offshore basins are interesting. The onshore basins, we're talking Amazon. And nowadays, Amazon is going to be very difficult to provide any oil production, because exploration and production activities are so environmentally impactful that it's going to be difficult to control that. And most of those countries already indicated that they're not willing to run that risk. They have significant indigenous population, so you don't expect to see too much activity onshore. Maybe what's going on, I think it will, more or less stay like that. But offshore, we could have interesting plays, some gas and so on. And then if we go to another country completely, Venezuela, theoretically the world's largest reserves, balderdash, all those numbers are meaningless. They're real numbers. If you take away the Orinoco and stuff, which is basic oil, it's not interesting to anybody now or 20 or 50 years from now. You're left with maybe that red area, and offshore is where their resources could be interesting. This is without even getting into the Guyana, right? This is offshore Venezuela. That could be interesting. So some potential there, but as I've spoken many other times in the past, I think Venezuela, from a geopolitical standpoint, is going nowhere. Unfortunately, despite its significant oil and gas potential, mostly offshore. And then if we go another slide, yes, we have reason to understand. We understand, and we have reason to believe that the conjugate margins uh, can provide very good information to either side. If you make discoveries here on this side, they have implications for Africa and vice versa. So, this has been known. Of course, it turns out that the West margin has probably a significantly higher potential, but it's still a conjugate margin. If we look down, another slide, this is beyond the normal Eastern conjugate margin analogies. We have in the equatorial margin, which is almost in the underarm of Africa, we have very significant discoveries in Guyana, and now Suriname is in play. So obviously, this region has already proven itself with over 10 billion uh, in understood producible resources. I think it'd probably get to something 20 or 30 based on some of the preliminary numbers we ran just with discoveries and number of wells drilled. So this is a very high potential area, but very restricted, still, very high potential. The Brazilian equatorial margin, we've spoken about this before, forget it, that's not interesting, other than the extreme corner there, the Potiguar Basin, that is already being developed by Petrobras. No, not so many environmental problems. So maybe that can be something a little bit more interesting. But as Cavagna knows, I always end up, go to the next one. I always end up with the pre-salt because as many interesting assessment units as there are, as many places there are in Brazil, as many basins that are producing and so on. I've often said you could just forget everything else and work the pre-salt as much as you want, and you would have enough activity in oil until the end of the oil age without having to put any effort into any of these other areas. But of course, that doesn't happen. So, we've had some very measured development of the pre-salt in great part because Brazil hasn't signaled that it's as welcoming as it might be, and we've had many problems in the past, and we still have mixed signals, but the potential is there. And as I said, 90% certainty that there's at least 19 billion barrels of recoverable oil in that pre-salt, and maybe up to 200 and some. So we're talking, say, in almost Saudi Arabia. And this is in an area that's very amenable to exploration and production. Yes, it's deep water, but technology has dominated that. Not any serious environmental impediments. Very prolific fields, so production costs are extremely low. Lifting costs of Petrobras are under $4. I mean, if you throw in FPSO costs, it's still $5. I mean, that's less than Saudi Arabia onshore production. So this is where I end up. That the whole area is interesting. A lot of niche plays, a lot of potential here and there, but there's an elephant in the room, and maybe not everybody will be looking at this, especially since this is a game for mostly the oil and gas majors. This is my punchline. The pre-salt is the dominant feature. This all relating to hydrocarbons. Maybe later we can talk about something else, but I'll leave it here and let Paul talk about some of these other areas.
This is still your slide.
No, you can take this. We'll talk about lithium and stuff later.
Okay, so thank you so much, Professor Cleveland Jones. So we could start with Paul Taylor. You are mute, Paul, please.
Hi.
Hi.
Okay. After that really interesting talk by Professor Cleveland, I'm feeling a little inadequate with some of mine. But I'm going to talk to you today about the potential of the region, some of its historical background, and the uncertainty that comes from operating in Argentina with the politics of the country. Argentina's offshore sedimentary basin is underexplored, and the reason for this is very difficult to understand because it's got one of the widest continental margins in the world. So why is it underexplored? Previous exploration drilling has concentrated mostly on the classical structural highs, but without an understanding of the uh, the kitchen areas in the area, in the offshore area, and they failed to find commercial volumes of hydrocarbons. Interestingly, we have the Argentine Basin and the Malvinas Basin and the Austral Basin. The Austral is really quite a developed area. There's a lot of activity going on there. The Malvinas Basin, which I've worked on, well, that geologically is not set up for trapping hydrocarbons. But more interestingly about the Malvinas is the lack of structures. Whereas the Argentine basin or the Argentina basin is truly underexplored and yet has huge potential. It's just that there's been a lack of exploration simply because in the past we didn't have the deep water drilling technology, nor did we have the understanding of deep water sediments and their potential that have for containing huge volumes of hydrocarbons has been discovered in offshore West Africa, plus many other places around the world. If we can go on to the next slide. So historically, the previous drilling has failed to encounter commercial volumes of hydrocarbons, and in part this was mostly due to the poor seismic imaging and the 2D seismic that was acquired from the 1960s to the 1990s. And as I've already said, the majority of the wells were drilled on structural highs and outside the source rock kitchen areas. So for example, all of the early wells drilled in the Malvinas area were drilled on the Paleo Shelf area, and all they found was top to bottom in the well was shale with very few sand stringers. And when you look at the deep water sediment areas, we didn't have the understanding of deep water sediments at that time. I did, but the company I was working for didn't. And that I think is quite symptomatic for many of the Argentine companies. They could really do with getting some deep water expertise. So the problem with the Malvinas area being that with all the wells drilled in the 50s and the 60s, finding only shale, the reworking of that shale into the basin area is only going to produce more very fine sediments. You do have the fold thrust front belt from the collision of the Scotia plate with the South Atlantic plate, but the seismic data over that shows very angular mountainous areas, and I use the word mountainous very carefully, showing that there's been very little erosion, and so coarse clastic sedimentary material is not being deposited into that basin. The recent discoveries based on these new play concepts, are using analogous basins. And as Professor Cleveland has pointed out, to the conjugate basins off West Africa and Southwest Africa. In fact, I use the Orange Basin off Southwest Africa as my conjugate analog. But the work being done by companies like Total and Shell in Namibia and others should have a huge impact on the development of these play concepts offshore Argentina. And but yeah, it's very difficult to understand why these basins have been ignored. So if we go to the next slide, please. Argentina has potential. This graph is showing that a study done by S&P Global back in 2023, Argentina's crude and condensate production forecast is very, very healthy, but we're not reaching that. If we can go to the next slide.
Sure.
International interest in Argentina started in the 90s and the 2000s, but they mostly concentrated in the Austral Basin area with companies like Pan America / BP. Acquiring seismic data offshore Argentina is relatively quite expensive because the seismic acquisition boats, the companies owning those boats, well, they fully booked in other parts of the world, West Africa, North Sea, Southeast Asia. So trying to get a boat to mobilize to the South Atlantic is quite an expensive operation, and your mob and demob fees are going to be quite high. But companies like Spectrum came in and they shot very large swaths of 2D data as non-speculative surveys, meaning that companies then could buy into these non-spec surveys, put subsurface teams of geoscientists onto this data, and developing some quite good interpretations that could identify leads that could then be developed into drillable prospects. If we can go to the next slide, please. So the future understanding of these plays really depends on the attitudes of the companies involved. But politics versus geology. Argentina recently had a political regime change, and we still don't know what President Miele is going to be doing. He's gained quite a following in Argentina, but politically, Argentina is quite bipartisan. The Argentine population, they always want to change their president, but they don't like the changes that the president introduces. And half the country will support the president, the other half will be in the streets of Buenos Aires protesting, or down in the Rio Gallegos area, they'll be having strikes because they don't like what's happening. And then you also have the rivalry between the local governance and federal governance. And this causes all kinds of political uncertainty in the country and for companies wishing to invest. Now, companies, especially international companies, they have a lot of experience of this, and they will build political risk into their investment decisions. But with countries like Argentina, it's very hard to judge what that political risk is and hard to quantify. So if we can go on to the next slide. Oh, sorry. I've jumped a little bit. I thought there was another slide. But we need to talk about lithium because the world needs lithium and it needs quite a lot of it. It's a very sought after mineral now in places like the Chile, Bolivia, and the Argentine Triangle. Outside China, another big producer of lithium. But Chile is the dominant producer of this mineral. Now, while many governments are trying to meet the demands to slow climate change and their introduction of targets, deadlines, and timelines to meet the supposed net zero that they want to achieve, lithium is becoming important because with the advent of electrical vehicles, EVs, by Tesla, lithium is in huge demand. And although Tesla has recently been overtaken as the major EV manufacturer by a Chinese company called BYD, they too are going to need a lot of lithium to create these batteries that go into the EVs. So the world needs a lot of lithium, and the mining companies with the experience and the expertise to explore for and mine the mineral. But the world is not on track to meet the impending lithium demand. For example, the recently elected president of Chile, Senor Gabriel Boric, and his government, they've announced a new lithium strategy, and they want the government to take control of that industry in the country. Of course, this is going to introduce huge political uncertainty for any companies that are investing there, and it will have an immediate effect on the capex and the opex being budgeted for by the companies currently operating there. And there's only two major companies operating in Chile. So if we go on to the next slide. So where does lithium come from? Um, Australia uses hard rock mining to produce lithium. Chile is able to produce the lithium from brine deposits, which are underground lakes of saline groundwater located under salt flats. Brine operations, though, have a longer lead time than hard rock mining. Now, interestingly, there's a company in Cornwall in England that is experimenting with innovative extraction techniques where they drill wells into thermal wells, and they extract the lithium by producing the geothermal water, and they're able to separate the lithium. Very interesting. And that is going to be very cost effective compared to the mining techniques. So if we go on to the next slide, as I said, the brine operations, they have a much longer lead time. And in, for example, in Australia, they can get from they can get to final investment decision in 4 years, whereas in Chile it takes 7 years. Is that due to um, corporate management, or is it due to government bureaucracy? I don't think we can answer that at this point. But the lithium that's produced in Chile from the brines has a lower greenhouse emissions intensity than the hard rock mining. We've all seen people propagate those photographs showing an EV plugged into a huge lithium mine that looks like an environmental disaster. It's a nice bit of propaganda, but that's the impression people have. And if we go to the next slide, so there are only, as I said in here, the slide, there are only about 8 operations in the world using lithium brines, but Chile is by far the most important producer. It holds 61% of the global lithium carbonate resources, and that was a figure published in 2021. So it's got an important role in the lithium carbonate market. And the lithium, as I've said, the lithium production is concentrated in just 2 companies in one area, the Atacama Desert area. So the challenge now is to expand that production both in Atacama and other areas like Bolivia and Argentina. But the problem is to try and attract those companies into the country that have the experience, the expertise, and the money to invest and to invest in a sustainable manageable production, and in a very sustainable way. So we have a critical set of questions surrounding Chile. Can it maximize the economic rents from these properties? Can those revenues be in excess of cost production? And how will the state and the local communities capture some of that wealth? And if we move to the last slide, the lithium market is huge. In 2020, it was forecast to be worth between 8 and 10 billion US dollars. However, in 2022, just 2 years later, the market was worth $48 billion. That's quite a significant amount of money. And even with those numbers, the expectation is huge margins. And that's for the next decade. So the Chilean government has a lot of leverage, but it really needs to think very carefully about how it's going to achieve enriching the country, enriching the local populations, giving employment to the people in the areas, especially Atacama. The Atacama area being a desert, it's not going to have a rich population. So the Chilean government really needs to think about this. Thank you very much.
Was excellent, Paul Taylor. Fantastic, because now, Cleveland Jones, we have material to discuss a little bit.
Yes.
Let me start with the first question for you both. Is there still space to invest in hydrocarbons in this region, or is it exhausted and there is no chance to have more discoveries and production to increase this activity in this region? Paul and Cleveland.
Let me say this. I am a believer that we have to produce and use the hydrocarbons, the good quality oil and gas that is available, that the world still needs until alternatives are reasonably available, and that may take 10, 20 years at least. So the activity has to migrate towards the best, most prolific, longest lasting, lowest cost in the most secure countries and regions in the world. And that is an inescapable trend that the majors have to follow. Indeed, we've seen some of that. I published some of that. Every time that a major leaves a problematic African country, I think they're in the back of their minds, they're doing this, or maybe moving offshore so they don't have the onshore exposure. This is inescapable. And the fact that I mentioned that the hydrocarbon potential is still so great in South America and in the cone in general is reason to expect that it will be developed, it will attract the funds, and it has to be selectively done in a few of those plays. That's my feeling for hydrocarbons. I don't know how Paul.
Yeah, it's interesting because Paul. So no new adventures in hydrocarbons with high risk exploration. Is your opinion too?
Well, you take the Argentine basin, totally unexplored. There's been some seismic interpretation done there. We don't even know if we have any structures there and whether they can hold economic amounts of oil or gas. I find that very exciting, and I think I would want to be there. For me, though, it's the political uncertainty that is a detraction, because you've got huge investments to make just drilling a single exploration well, a single deep water exploration well. And that's going to play heavily on your risk analysis.
Paul, let me say this. I think you're right. And the fact that you have one of the widest or the widest shelf, this is a potential that, if you're going to explore it, you have tremendous area to do so. Now, unfortunately, let me say this. I think that by the time anything gets going and gets discovered, and gets developed and gets ready for production, the game is over. Too late, it won't matter. Unfortunately, the realities of the world as energy transitions are occurring, and we've already discussed this looking at lithium. This is part of the transition, besides a lot of the other fuels that are being considered, the renaissance of nuclear and so on. So unfortunately, this window of opportunity is no more, by far less than 20 years. And if this takes 10, 15 years, you're already, half the war is lost. I
But
think
Cleveland,
that the advantage is that there are some niche plays, even in Argentina, maybe closer to shore, some areas that you can develop more quickly and you can explore more quickly. Maybe you're not going to look for elephants, but there are areas that you can focus on that might be a little bit quicker, and you can do it within that window.
but Cleveland,
Possibly.
there is a portion of oil that cannot be replaced by renewables. So
Right.
for petrochemical and for logistics, for ships and tanks, military tanks. So this part of the oil will remain useful and interesting for a long time. So if you do not find new reserves and new production, we can fail in terms of price and things like that. Paul Taylor.
Well, I've thought about this for the last 7 or 8 years. Europe will be trying very hard to go to net zero, um, and with the abolishment of fossil fuel cars by 2030 or 2035, yeah, that's going to have a big impact on the oil consumed in Europe. The US, I really don't know. But if you think about Africa, there's a lot of people driving cars there. And look, those countries that produce oil, they're not going to be in any hurry to lower their emissions. They will be wanting to use the oil that they can get cheaply out of the ground. And that's North Africa, West Africa, and now with some of the fields being developed in Lake Alberta in Uganda, East Africa is also getting its own supply of hydrocarbons. India doesn't have oil, it has a few fields up in Rajasthan, and that's it. Although Reliance do have a couple of fields in the deep water area in the Krishna Basin.
A drop in the bucket for India.
Exactly.
Paul
And
is right. I mean, this is something that people don't understand. There's something that the Switch Energy Alliance points out. The energy poor of the world are becoming more active in the economy. They're growing from being miserable and burning cow dung to using gas and oil and so on. That population is 2.5 billion people. That will support the demand for hydrocarbons as the entry energy for them. There is no way to escape that. So the only thing that I differ on is that I think that we're okay because we have enough basins that are very productive and have great accumulations that can carry us through that. But as Paul pointed out, we have to consider alternatives, for example, like lithium. And certainly I am a proponent that technology can bring about changes, drastic changes that we might not even imagine. And indeed, Exxon and others are already have in place, direct lithium extraction from brine waters, from produced water in wells. That is a development that if you open that up and it becomes really viable and commercially producible, that opens up zillions of oil wells in the world to that.
Yeah, but that's a good point, Cleveland, because nowadays the world consumes around 100 million barrels a day. How do you expect to have this volume in 2050, for instance? Half of this volume or 70% of this volume?
More.
So,
50 to 60. That's half. Yeah, it may be more.
okay,
but you see
but
that's
this
still
volume,
a lot.
But yeah, but this volume, we do we have enough reserves and
Yeah,
capacity and potential to produce to this
yes. I think I mentioned
2100?
once, if you just look at, well, certainly, as I said, the Brazilian offshore margin, the Middle East, as much as that is a problematic
Yeah.
area, the Gulf of
Uh-huh.
Mexico, and a lot of the conventional areas of production, even offshore Africa, some Southeast Asia, they're reasonably safe enough that majors can remain there and produce there. They will try their best to reduce their risk, produce even if it's not efficiently and get out of there quickly to recover their capital. But the world is not in risk of running out of those hydrocarbons
What
even by then.
what do you say is that we do not go to the risky exploration at this time? We have enough.
Right,
Uh,
frontier area, yeah.
okay.
Highly speculative frontier areas, I think, are out of the question, which is so sad because, as Paul said, we have frontier areas that are so exciting. Explorationists like him, and I can't
Yeah.
consider myself one, but would drool at the opportunity to conduct much better seismic, to discover what structures are there, to begin to understand how that can perform. And we already have information about the concrete margin successes. We have up north, the Brazilian successes. It's potentially a very
Yeah.
large play. We already have the equatorial margin that can grow still. We have the Gulf of Mexico can have a renaissance because the United States basically
Yeah.
forgot about the Gulf of Mexico for a long time because they were enamored just with shale. And now we're beginning to realize, hey, the Gulf of Mexico, you make a discovery, you have 20 years worth of production. You don't have to
Uh-huh.
go on this mad treadmill of drilling every year just to replace your production. So this
Yeah.
has going to go on a growth path. But I agree, the opportunities for new energies, and if you look at even hydrogen, natural
Yeah, before
hydrogen.
we go to the renewables, going to the Paul, your conclusions about hydrocarbons before we go to the
Yeah,
renewables, based on what Cleveland said just now.
Uh, um,
Cleveland was too
I think
provocative.
I still think there's a lot of potential um, for hydrocarbon use over the next 70 to 80 years. I think Cleveland has a very good point about exploration in frontier areas. Um, but there again, exploration is picking up. We're seeing a lot more exploration wells drilled. What I haven't done is look to see whether they are in truly frontier areas or if they just near
Extending.
field near field exploration. I think all companies will be concentrating a lot.
You are Cleveland. You are mute. Okay.
I wanted to just ask Paul, Arctic is frontier. Despite the warming and the ice shelf is melting, making things easier, that's frontier. But that's extremely difficult. That's not going to come on very quickly.
No, for example, there was a lot of talk about Arctic exploration and the Russians planting the flag on the seafloor many years ago. Now that's out of the question. But places like offshore Argentina, yeah, but I really don't know what the climate is like there in terms of do they have uh, huge swells and making the installation of offshore platforms difficult. I really don't know. But I think it is possible that deep water offshore Argentina is a good area to explore. Another great frontier area, but it's only frontier because it's political, and that's offshore Cuba. I've explored both North and South Cuba. That's got incredible potential, but politically, it's not.
Yeah.
It's never.
Possible.
It's not going to be possible to develop anything there. Um,
The eastern coast of the United States, for example, has some potential, but it's not
Yeah.
going to get anywhere.
No, I mean, you got Newfoundland off Canada, which is very long tradition of exploration and development, and that expertise can be exported quite easily to countries like Argentina, deep water exploration off Chile and Ecuador and Peru. Not so, yeah, even Colombia is starting to look offshore now. Ecopetrol are looking offshore rather than the traditional plays up in the Andes. So, but I think hydrocarbons still have a long life,
Yeah,
very long life. It's just that the companies will have a transitioning of their focus. It'll be focused right now, they want to find new hydrocarbons, but then it will just simply be let's develop those hydrocarbons until we they stop demanding it.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Good. Let's go to the renewables because Paul mentioned lithium, and but of course not only lithium. We have cobalt and nickel and other copper, etc. And you mentioned that Chile is 61% of worldwide production, but they produce only in terms of mining. They do not process this material. They need to send to China to be processed. This material is it correct?
I'm not sure if you are correct, but it's something that I could find out about for you. Uh,
But here's the difference, Paul. Um, that's the case for mining, brine lakes, and so on. That is not the case for direct lithium extraction from oil wells, where you direct lithium extraction, you get very concentrated production. So the question is technology sufficiently near the turning point that you can say in 5 years, say, will all of that dominance of production completely change? And I think so. I think that just as with unconventionals, the United States was first and dominated, and everybody else trying, but not even China or Vaca Muerta is getting close. I think the same thing can happen with direct lithium extraction from shale patch in the U.S. And now we're on the verge of having an explosion of production again in the United States, dominating this as they did with the shale patch, a production that can grow extremely because this once you manage this, you can multiply this and get direct lithium extraction for very inexpensive costs from areas that are spread all over the shale patch. Sure, there's some in China and elsewhere, but just like the unconventionals,
Yeah,
they'll dominate, and I don't think there'll be much space elsewhere.
no, you're right, but in the US, you have an attitude of embracing change and identifying innovative ideas. Mining companies may not, if they've only been producing the lithium, for example, in Chile that way for the last 40, 50 years, they need somebody to come and prod them and say, hey, I think I've got a better idea for you on how to produce it. I'm not the kind of person who can do that, but I think possibly they they need somebody to come along and say, I've got a really good idea. I have a cunning plan, as Blackadder would say.
But can you imagine the geopolitical implications of the dominance of China and the importance of even the
yeah,
triangle that I showed there, Chile, Argentina, completely being changed in less than 10 years? I think this is the pace, maybe
no,
5 years.
no,
This
yeah,
this is just blows your mind because if this happens, the world will
not
change
likely.
very, very much.
Well, if the Chilean government decides to continue with its strategy of, I hate to use this word, nationalizing
Yeah,
the mining industry,
Oh my God.
we're not going to see that change.
exactly.
So we have this political uncertainty. But there again, Chile is a bit like Argentina. They will swing from one side of the political spectrum to the other side at the next election. And whoever the next president is, he or she may be welcoming the the privileged position that Chile is in by having these huge resources and the dominant amount of resources of lithium in the world, because they can apply huge leverage to lots of commercial companies and governments around the world.
And
Yeah.
what other countries have this reserve in lithium production mining? Which other?
Uh, England has some, and in fact, the first lithium mines were developed in 1864, I believe, by somebody from University College of London in the Cornwall area. China, Chile,
China.
Australia. There are five.
Australia?
Yeah, there are five countries, but I don't know what the other
Yeah,
two are.
yeah,
But
yeah. But
Australia and Chile are the biggest ones.
it's
But can you
interesting because
imagine,
Cleveland said,
Giovanni,
yeah,
go back to if the game changes, just like with shale oil, if the game changes and this change can occur in 5 or 10 years, then as much potential as there might be in many of these regions, this could be eclipsed because of cost considerations, because the cost of the direct lithium extraction from oil wells could be substantially less, and especially because you're going the whole cycle down to the concentrate. Whereas, the other, you have to mine and then you have to sand and improve it and so on. This is a game changer. We have to recognize that even though we're not there yet, the experiments are already undergoing now, and we could be seeing this in the next 3 years. We could
and,
see major pilot projects.
and the activists can move from avoiding oil to avoiding mining lithium, and because
They
the
weren't too
impact, the
successful.
environmental impact is too strong in terms of mining, no?
They weren't too successful in stopping oil industry. I don't think that they would have the same objection, say, with lithium, because there is even a driver might exactly be the geopolitical implications, because now the whole world is not just the United States is worried about their dependence on China as the major refining area. So this could change things. But as you mentioned, there are alternatives. If you go into biofuels and so on, you have another category that can be very significant, that is completely independent from hydrocarbons and lithium and so on, which is besides solar and wind, which big
but the volumes, the volumes, Cleveland, is not so representative as oil and lithium and things like that.
You have to be careful, because what you're talking about in terms of oil production in some of the countries, you could surpass that very quickly with some of the projects that are in place now, which I don't agree with. I think it's, maybe 5 or 10 years that they will be rethought. But this hydrogen production from oil, from wind and solar energy, which Northeast Brazil is pushing millions of tons of hydrogen projects. This is too big.
Expensive.
It's expensive, and I don't think it's going to go anywhere. In 10 years, they'll say, "Why did we do this?"
Dangerous.
Yeah, they'll regret it. But if you look at bioenergy, fuels produced from corn and sugarcane and other agricultural products, that is a different game, because now you're talking volumes that could be very significant.
But the volumes are not so representative comparing to oil and lithium and batteries and so on.
Not yet, but if you just look at the U.S., the largest producer of ethanol in the world, eclipsing Brazil even, but Brazil, of course, can probably multiply that by 5 times or 10 if they use agricultural areas that are already degraded but would be suitable for sugarcane and so on. Then you could see if there is a signal, if there is a basis for establishing confidence in the demand, that you could multiply biofuel production manyfold. And it won't challenge 50 or 60 billion barrels a day of oil, a million barrels a day of oil, but it can be very significant in terms of new energies being produced for exactly the uses that you were talking about, transportation, which requires basically liquid fuels to be really efficient. And this is what biofuels could address directly without all of this conversion into batteries, which is complicated.
Yeah.
My question would be is we can produce these, well, we have these vehicles that can use biofuels, but what about the industries that have to manufacture those vehicles? What kind of
Motors
fuel?
and equipment and so on.
Exactly. They could even
Must be
continue
adapted.
to be the old-fashioned industries running the way they are, but the demand of the products that they produce will be completely changed if you have, as we did in Brazil, the alternative fuel nowadays is gasoline,
Ethanol motors.
because ethanol is between the pure ethanol and the mixed ethanol is more than the gasoline use. So we're already there. You know, the United States is still down at 10, 12% mix and so on. Some countries are at 27 and more. This is a trend that is often overlooked, especially because in the U.S. ethanol is corn. Corn has this thing about being food. Well, it could be pig food, but you know, the growth potential is there. You can't argue against that.
So we could conclude that we need all energies, including bio
We will have a
batteries,
mix.
lithium, oil. We need everything.
We will have a very wide mix, and maybe even things that we haven't really discussed or talked about, because, like I said, nuclear is making a comeback. That could make significant strides.
Yeah.
Give it 10, 20 years.
And then somebody one day will actually be able to harness the nuclear fusion rather than fission.
Yeah, that's always 20 or 30 years in the future, but maybe, yeah.
Maybe 20 years in the future. Good.
Very good.
So, gentlemen, was fantastic conversation. I'm totally sure that people will love this video and will comment in LinkedIn and other place. Please, thank you so much.
We'll make a meeting if need be. Great.
It was great. Thank you very much, Armando.
Yeah, please
Bye, Paul. Bye,
do not go. Stay a little bit more. I on the screen here.